So, all right, I guess we'll start to get started now. So, I guess what we'll do is we'll go with the introductions for everyone in the room right now. I'm just kidding. We're not going to do that at all. That would take up the entire meeting time. Uh, no, I'd like to thank you all for signing up for the NAACP training through the Eugene-Springfield NAACP Health Committee. This training is entitled Creating Trust-Based, Patient-Centered, Anti-Racist Patient-Provider Relationships. The training is 4 sessions. It will be on Thursdays, on the third Thursday of each month for the next few months until the end of August. Each session will have a speaker that will speak about 40 minutes, 45 minutes or so. There will be a 5-minute wellness check with Dr. Ali Ravelis. That's just to kind of make sure that we're all okay in that safe space, right? Just kind of dealing with the information that we're talking about and not being triggered here. In case you do feel triggered or you feel some emotions about these things, because it is a touchy subject. I get it. Racism can be very triggering for all of us. We do have Elaine Waters from Trauma Healing Project as well. If you, I believe Elaine may put her phone number in the chat here that you'll be able to call her and just kind of talk with her through that. Yeah, Elaine is also there, a couple of squares below me in the chat.
Yeah, we'll put my phone number in there so you can text or chat me or just reach out directly that way. Or we don't have breakout rooms set up for this session, but for now, if you want to reach out, you can private message me or you can chat me on my cell phone, and I'll put that in the chat for everybody, and then we'll find a spot to just pay attention to whatever's coming up for you. Thank you.
Yeah. During the Q&A session, after that, there will be like a Q&A session for about 30 minutes. In that Q&A session, you'll be able to ask questions via the chat, or you can use the raise hand function on the Zoom to ask the question to the speaker yourself, if you like that. Just to take advantage of maybe a practice of this, how many of you providers in here have had any anti-racism training in med school? If you have, use the raise hand function. Not very many, or not at all that I can see. One? Okay, awesome. And that was kind of like the response that we have. So how we came up with this as the NAACP, couple, a few, nice, I like it. How we came up with this, we were having some discussion about the historical narratives that produce some of the racial biases that we can still see today, right? We talked about experiences we had or people we knew had with the healthcare setting with the provider. It turned into how it played a role with the trust issues with providers. And then we asked that question, like how much training or discussion about racism and systemic racism do providers get in med school? Being that this is such a big part, race plays a big part in everything in our lives, and with the people we see and that we deal with. I work in healthcare myself, not as a provider, of course, but we see the disparities with health and race. So we decided to put this training together to help develop that discussion about racism in healthcare and how providers could align with their patients to create that trust. This is one of our first kind of trainings that we're putting together. The next one we want to do was to put it from the other angle with the patient, with the provider. Our first speaker is Mark Harris. Mark G. Harris has a Master's of Arts in psychology. He's a certified alcohol and drug counselor with a master addiction counselor as well. He's an award-winning journalist, an educator, a therapist, a storyteller, and a trainer. And while he's semi-retired, which people that are semi-retired aren't retired, He continues to operate in the field of mental health, SUD, ethnic studies, and culturally proficient complementary medicine. Mark is a son, he's a brother, he's a father of doctors from a Black medical family. He grew up learning about segregated medicine, and effectively dealing with educational and health disparities. He has worked in the addiction field for about 48 years and lived in an institutional racism learning laboratory, that is Oregon, for over 38 years. Mark has trained addiction workers, combat veterans, first responders, and community outreach workers, particularly specializing in reducing traditional, current, and emerging health disparities and co-occurring disorders. Mark is also a part of our NAACP and a part of our subcommittee here. He's a wealth of knowledge, and I kid you not, this man is a wealth of knowledge. We are truly grateful to have him as our first speaker for this training. And with that said, I'm going to turn this over to Mark.
Thank you, Damon. It's a pleasure to be here. And it's great to see the fruits of our labor not only bear fruit, but begin to flower again. Part of the history, I guess my history, which I'll go into, and thanking our sponsors and all that kind of stuff, is I wanted to call this originally medical micro-resistance. So my particular talk in creating trust-based, patient-centered, anti-racist patient-provider relationships, medical micro-resistance. Now, in the position that I've been in, where you're dealing with uncomfortable subjects like people's substance abuse disorders or addictions, and you have to, even though I was trained to be a counselor, and I was trained on a 50-minute hour where you're building rapport in that hour, with certain populations, you don't have 50 minutes, you have 30 seconds to make an impression. So that means you have to be real and honest about the things that they're facing and they're bringing to you. And that's part of how you build trust, by talking about the difficult stuff till it becomes easier. So when I talk about a therapeutic response for people who may hate you, I have skinhead clients, Klansman clients. That's not hyperbole, that's literally card-carrying Klansmen building trust and rapport with a person with not only an excellent suntan, but with a hairstyle that traditionally signifies danger to people who don't consider all human beings part of their family, shall we say. So when I show the graphic of I'm just a simple country drug counselor, and that's an Ethiopian picture of Christ raising Lazarus from the dead, and one of his sayings quoted in the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, "You suffer because you love what deceives you." And that is certainly true for racism, and that is certainly true for addictive disease in terms of pointing towards the cure. You have to basically engage in courageous truth-telling. And you also have to be clinical, because I consider myself part of the medical community. And I was raised, as Damon said, thank you for the introduction. I was raised in a medical family, a Black medical family, and a Black psychological medical family. And so many, as opposed to mainstream American Psychological Association, which to this day doesn't believe that racism exists, nor sexism exists as having psychological or emotional impact. There's a reason and there's a history of that, which I'll touch on very briefly. So part of the learning objectives is that you'll be able to learn certain constructs that I've kind of front loaded in the talk from practice-based evidence and community-defined evidence, and reason being that there is no replicated evidence-based research that shows that racism exists or has psychological impact. So when you're talking with docs and providers, they like science, and I like science too, but there's a dearth of information. So I had to basically develop practice-based evidence from people of color and women who basically said, this is what's happening to us. Here's a way out of it. So participants learn personal and systemic strategies to counter individual and systemic racism, because you have to do both. And hopefully you'll gain some suggestions for patient interactions that counter the effects of individual and systemic racism, and learning how to build trust effectively, fearlessly, and acknowledging uncomfortable truths and beginning that healing process. So I wanted to start it out with construct I've been teaching for a number of years out of the literature in Black psychology, and also the Black legal community, civil rights legal community, 6 types of isms. Now, the original literature focused on racism as a discriminator, and because it's often so difficult to talk about, I like to approach it algebraically. That is, you do the hardest thing first, and you work through systematically until you resolve the problem. The hardest thing first. So racism, 6 types of racism. So overt physical or verbal attacks, type 1. Type 2, verbal or physical microaggressions. That's from Dr. Chester M. Pierce and Daryl Wing Su, who've written extensively about that. Type 3 is unconscious institutional quasi-illegal. It's quasi-illegal because, for example, while use of the N-word is illegal within a workplace, microaggressions are not recognized legally. So people can commit damaging acts within their workplace, and the targets, I like to use the word targets rather than victims, the targets can't really do anything except, for example, just let it roll off your back, if you will, which I want to identify that micro-resistance actually involves more than just simply letting it roll off your back. It means responding in a healing, therapeutic way. Type 4, conscious institutional, where it is legal and overt. So the institution is actually following the law when it discriminates. For example, the state of Oregon, which basically legally banned Black American citizens from coming to Oregon, and also upon either pain of lashing or arrest, discriminated against them in various ways. Jim Crow South under the United States under slavery, Nazi Germany, apartheid South Africa. So the institutions are following the law and carrying out their legal function. Now, when the laws change, then and discrimination becomes illegal, many of the same practices remain in place. And that's why there's unconscious institutional, and then type 5, conscious institutional, where the discrimination is illegal and covert, but if you detect it, you have to follow a legal procedure where you have rules of evidence, you have to have time to file and things like that. And if you don't do everything in the right order, then you have no case. Therefore, you can take no legal action against these actions that happen all over the place. So for example, when I was attempted redlined in buying my first house in Eugene, it was in fact illegal for the bank to charge me more for credit and a mortgage. And they were told that because I basically had to involve the federal government to threaten them to just let me have the house at the price that we had negotiated. And then type 6, Sociostructural Violence, which was named by Dr. Franz Fanon, a Black psychiatrist trained in France, who was stationed in Algeria in a mental hospital. And he noticed a curious thing, that Black patients and white patients in the same institution with the exact same diagnosis, the white patients would get drugs and talk therapy, the Black patients would get torture and no drug therapy, just torture. So the idea that this was a normal legal practice that basically expressed the values of society without necessarily any civil rights action. So one of the markers of sociostructural violence is if something happens disproportionately in terms of the numbers. So for example, because I'm an SUD guy, an addictions guy, what I've noticed, for example, is when Ron and Nancy Reagan were saying just say no, 80% of the illegal drug users in the country were white men who made in excess of $50,000. 13% of the illegal drug users were white women. So if you add those things together, then the other illegal drug users are minority. And Black people were 3% of that number in the 80s. So who's getting arrested and who's doing time for that? And the police made a decision to arrest not the large numbers of drug dealers and drug users. They decided that the Black drug dealers that were supplying the white drug users were the ones that were arrestable, not the white drug users. So disproportionately fueling the war on drugs, basically expressing as Black incarceration rather than treatment, even if you did have a substance abuse problem. So sociostructural violence. A few constructs out of Black psychology. The idea of racism as a disease, and depending on what your discipline is, my degrees are in psychology and I was raised by a Black psychiatrist. So naturally we think of racism as a mental illness. And this idea was actually expressed by Albert Einstein in the 50s, basically said that unfortunately, racism is an American tradition, that it's like a disease. It needs to be treated with education because it's persistent. But now, because he's a quantum physicist and an anti-racist activist, that part of his history is kind of hidden, but it's Einstein saying that. You don't have to be a genius to be an anti-racist, but there was an anti-racist genius. Then Dr. Chester Pierce, who wanted to basically talk about racism as a mental illness, very similar to alcoholism. So in other words, a vectorless, pathogenless, chronic, progressive disease with epigenetic and genetic components multi-generational stress and trauma-related disease, and basically treat it with a talking cure. And as early as the 60s, 1965, and a group of Black psychologists were going to present a paper to the New York meeting of American Psychological Association on April 5th, 1968. My father was at that meeting. And why that date was significant for me is it's the day after Martin Luther King was assassinated. And so from my personal feeling, my history teacher said that he was glad that Martin was killed because he's a troublemaker. My homeroom teacher agreed with him. And they tried to suspend me and my whole table in class for not standing up for saying the flag salute, because we said, look, if Martin Luther King deserved to die, then liberty and justice for all is a lie. We're not participating in it. I'm not going to say the flag salute until liberty and justice for all is a reality, but I'm willing to fight for that reality to make that happen. Across the country in New York, my father and a group of other people, including Dr. Pierce, were kind of demoralized after Martin getting killed, because that kind of illustrated how did he get killed for advocating for constitutionally protected rights, and he was assassinated. That kind of proves that racism is a mental illness. If the people who killed Emmett Till and all the other police killings, lynchings, and things like that are committed by people that you're considering normal, perhaps normal is not normal. And maybe your normal isn't sanity for us. So as a SUD guy, one of the things I notice, racism as a co-occurring disorder, which kind of plays into the second, racism is a disease, that many racists commit their acts under the influence. So whether that's alcoholism or methamphetamine or other types of drugs that cause organicity or basically increase their psychosis, you basically can follow some of the treatment protocols in terms of abstinence from illegal mind or mood altering chemicals, but Prozac does not cure being a Klansman. So there are some limits to the usual modalities that we've been taught, but there is some efficacy to be found in directly talking about why do you feel this way. Racism as a pandemic, mimetic viral construct that when I was first introduced to the concept of memes in the mid 80s, began applying that to gang populations as a cure, to talk about you need to regenerate the mimetic core of what would generate your core beliefs. So racism as a pandemic, racism as a public health problem, which kind of goes along with the concept of racism as a mimetic pandemic. You basically develop a vaccine of education, if you will. Addiction as slavery, which is the second oldest recovery framework on this continent, the first one being the indigenous Wellbriety movement, the Code of Handsome Lake. Addiction as slavery was developed by Frederick Douglass, who freed himself from slavery, but had an alcohol problem. And this was before alcoholism was considered a disease. So his quote, his take was, we cannot stumble our way to freedom. That slavery is as much a part of the gross domestic product of this country as far as the financial infrastructure. Chattel slavery is as much a part of that GDP as the school to prison pipeline, the prison industrial complex, and other shall we say, institutions that keep people in bondage, if not literally, but figuratively. So to micro-resistance, as explained by Dr. Pierce, who created the construct of microaggressions, micro-resistance is your optimal response to microaggressions. So sometimes there's no outward response, and that might be optimal, or no outward response is possible. But it could be an inner response, may be more powerful in terms of building up your inner immune system to be able to detect systemic discrimination or racism, and strengthen that inner immune response and identify and remember what's happening to you and whatever the optimal response is. So a very common microaggression that happened to me in Oregon, particularly while I was working, was people would make appointments with me over the phone. And even though I was on television, even though I'd done columns in the local newspapers and things like that, public figure, people would make appointments with Mark Harris, and then they'd walk into my office and they say, I'm looking for Mark Harris. And I say, that's me. Oh, you don't look the way you sound over the phone. I sound taller? Yes. So part of the micro-resistance is you adapt your personal style, whatever that is. So I'm drawing the person out. What did I look like over the phone in your mind's eye? Oh, 6'8", blonde hair, blue eye, good looking. And I said, well, I'm trained to make my voice sound white. This is my white voice, but my voice is black at the roots. And then she blushed and I go, you must be from Oregon. She said, yeah, born and raised in Eugene. How did you know? I'm from LA. This is how Black medical professionals sound from LA. California newscaster English, no accent. Ha ha ha. Now, you came here for a recovery meeting, right? And then you go on with your business. So, all right, my voice sounded quote unquote white, or as Danny Glover said in a particular movie, sorry to bother you, your white voice. Yeah, I can take on various accents at various times, and I'm not going to speak Ebonics with people who don't understand that coded message. That's not appropriate until it is appropriate to make a point. That's what's up. So micro-resistance, they may not know that they're doing the microaggression. They might not. So you educate them to say, okay, this is a package of performance and service you weren't expecting, but we can move on from there. Now, the skinheads or the Aryan Brotherhood reentry citizens, who are in recovery and have a history, well, basically you have to do the outreach to them and give the appropriate response that kind of makes you a safe person to reveal their issues with. So for example, somebody's wearing a Thor's hammer wolf head and they're calling themselves Bjorn, and that's not the name on their student ID. I can ask, where'd you do time? And they can say, what do you mean? What did I do? Where'd you do time? Well, Texas. Okay, so you couldn't join the Nation of Islam. You couldn't join the Mexican Mafia. You're part of the Aryan Brotherhood. I would guess an Odinist if you're wearing a Thor's hammer as a wolf head and calling yourself Bjorn. Listen, I'm going to get you into treatment. in 2 hours because you seem to be in early DTs. So can you take medical advice from a person with an excellent suntan? And he laughs and like, okay, I just have to give you the barrier. I'm not afraid of you. I deal with gangs. A drug counselor from LA dealt with gangs. So, you know, prison gangs here, like run the drug trade and other things like that. I want to get you into treatment and we can deal with your issues about being gang raped by your skinhead homies after detox. But for now, let's get you into treatment. Then again, with microaggressions, micro-resistance, so that's building trust, truth-telling, fearless, courageous, deal with the issue that might be the most blocking to them. If there's systemic discrimination, you address it and say, I'm a safe person by acknowledging the forms that the discrimination takes. Then again, you know, if they do actually mean the microaggression, like, I mean, buckwheat as a term of endearment, when actually that was a Colorado legislator talking on YouTube to someone who was a Black legislator. And I mean buckwheat in an endearing thing. I mean, this African-American family is in a tar baby situation, which Google says is an emotionally sicky situation. No. I don't care what Google says. I was raised that tar baby is an ethnic slur like the N-word. You shouldn't be using that in therapy, no matter what your Microsoft Word dictionary or Google says. Sorry. And if it's a Black therapist telling you that in the room, listen to them, right? Then you can basically talk about discretionary and discerning right action. Do no harm, but don't internalize the harm either with your therapeutic response. I wanted to talk about Dr. Pierce. So he created the construct of microaggressions where he basically, the top photograph of Pierce Peak in Antarctica, he was a Navy Commodore, Black psychiatrist, so an MD, and he studied the psychological effect of extreme environments. And basically, from his pioneering work in Antarctica, he coined the concept of racial microaggressions by saying, being Black in America is like being in Antarctica. You're not necessarily being called the N-word every day. You're not witnessing a lynching every day, but you are basically experiencing daily insults to your psychological well-being. And the construct of microaggressions assumes you will get no validation from mainstream America. In fact, you'll be gaslighted. So you have to understand what's happening to you and then develop that response. So engaging in micro-resistance, which included personal protective resiliency. So what Chet Pierce referred to as micro-resistance, because other people took up his work, he died a couple of years ago. Other people started taking up his work, most notably Daryl Wing Su and Lisa Beth Spanierman in the second edition of the book, Microaggressions in Everyday Life. What he called micro-resistance, Daryl Wing Su calls micro-interventions. That means you're a trained person consciously delivering the interventions that you assume to be there. So for example, if I know that 75% of women entering substance use treatment have experienced sexual trauma, then I'm going to ask, have you experienced sexual trauma? and they may deny it, but I may apply healing in any case, because it's generally strengthening the host, to use the public health model. And frequently, what I found is even when they were with women's treatment, they didn't feel that they could reveal their sexual abuse trauma with women's treatment, but could reveal it with me. So if a BIPOC woman is sexually abused by her,
Oh, that's an hour. I thought it was noonish.
Well,
and
in Oregon,
yeah, thanks. If she is sexually abused by her by her white racist stepfather and chooses to self-medicates as a coping skill, so I know that if I refer her to treatment, that they better be able to deal with both racial and sexual trauma simultaneously. That's just what's indicated. So Daryl Wingsu talks about microaffirmation and microintervention, which means you have to know what the correct counter intervention is, given the assault to their integrity. So part of the history that in medicine, because I teach not only substance abuse and training addiction workers and interveners, I also teach a two-term ethnic study, African-American history class, ethnic studies class that starts in 15,000 BC and goes to the present day. The symbol of medicine, the caduceus, is a symbol of an awakened being from Egypt. So you have the staff of the spine, life force spiraling up the spine, which is symbolized by twin uraeuses, which are winged cobras. And they are intersecting at what are referred to in Egypt as the spheres of Ra. And Egypt colonized India and brought the concept of yoga to India. And so part of the concept of even Om is on a papyrus 5,000 years ago, right? So part of medicine is specialized language. So the people were taught 26 characters, but doctors were taught a language of 2,000 characters consisting of, for example, parts of the eye and body parts and other things that gave them specialized knowledge, along with self-care and along with other moral, ethical frameworks that enabled you to do healing work. And Kemetic peoples, Kemet, Egypt, was a multiracial society. So how do we get from training medical multiracial doctors to segregated healthcare? So this is 20th century, what this particular slide shows: colored surgery, white surgery. These are, I believe, I forgot what they're called exactly, but it's dentistry. So separate instruments because we had segregated medicine. So part of the psychological literature that was not part of my undergraduate and graduate training, I didn't have this history. It was Freud and psychopathology and psychopharmacology and other things like that, but nothing about systemic discrimination. I actually had to get that from my parents' personal library, which included Frantz Fanon and many of their Black psychiatrist homies, if you will. In its long and ugly history in the United States, White racism has improvised 1,000 variations on two themes. Black people are born with inferior brains and a limited capacity for growth. Their personality tends to be abnormal, whether by nature or nurture. And these concepts of inferiority and pathology are interrelated and reinforce each other. Both have served to sanctify a hierarchical social order, which the Negro's place is forever ordained by his genes and the accumulated disabilities of its past, which doesn't necessarily identify as Kemet, Egypt, as part of Africa, but the sanitized Middle East. The traditional corollary to this view, say Thomas and Sillin, is that Black people function best when they stay in their place, i.e. inferior to whites. Social tasks and equality actually generate mental pathology, mental illness. So for example, Dr. Benjamin Rush, who the American Psychological Association until 2015 kind of openly acknowledged as their founding father. He's a slave owner, signer of the Constitution. He believed that Black peoples had permanent leprosy. My excellent suntan? Leprosy? Wait. His mentee, Samuel Cartwright, white Southern physician, coined maladies which afflicted runaway slaves. Drapetomania aegypticus, the flight from home malady. In other words, slaves were mentally ill for escaping slavery. And diaesthesia aethiopicus, i.e. rascality by overseers, slaves destroyed property, avoided work, and raised disturbances with overseers. at a later stage and a later, more intractable stage. There was segregated health education. So the National Dental Association, which also could be the Negro Dental Association, National Medical Association, Negro Medical Association, HBCUs. When my father, growing up in San Francisco, was going to medical school, UCSF only admitted one Black student per year in 1955. And they had already admitted there. So he went to Meharry, as did my daughter. Things did change. My sister went to Berkeley. So AMA did not admit Black doctors until the 60s and elected its first Black president in the 80s. So I could ask the question when I did this talk for the Lane County Medical Society, who were the first Black doctors or doctors of color in Oregon or Lane County. My wife and I did a history of Eugene, and Black people could not necessarily be born in what is now Peace Health. The first Black person born at Peace Health, her birth certificate lists her as white. And since her parents and her look like me, what are they hiding there? Black folks born in Eugene used to be treated at the old Eugene Clinic. There was a doctor that treated them there. So Blacks couldn't live within the city limits before 1968. So that's kind of like the overt conditions that might mirror the medical conditions. So a vignette. A Black person who was playing, hurt their arm, went to a civilian hospital. The doctor did not examine him. The 9-year-old cousin noticed the bone was sticking out and the arm was broken. But when they went to the civilian hospital, the doctor, without examining him, said that he had a sprain. The family decided to go to the military hospital because they were part of the military, and x-rays showed it broken in 3 places. Why didn't the ER do the due diligence, the standard medical treatment? Young Black couple are told their newborn, low birth weight baby has a genetic abnormality without specifying what the genetic abnormality is. Upon forced early discharge, they are informed the baby has a heart murmur, but is discharged without a referral to NICU or a fetal heart monitor. Baby dies at 29 days old. Subsequent genetic testing reveals no genetic abnormality. So even though the N word isn't used, that would be racial discrimination in healthcare in both the vignettes that we've talked about. So let's entertain questions.
So I think we're going to take that 5-minute health check just to kind of give everybody that moment there, and then we'll go into that Q&A part of it where folks can ask questions. So if you give me just a second here, we'll get that started. Just undid it, okay.
Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Allie Revelis. I'm a licensed psychologist with strong integrated behavioral health, and I'm going to be leading you in a grounding exercise today. The topics discussed in the training today can be triggering, especially for BIPOC people. So if your nervous system is activated, I hope you find this exercise a helpful way to calm it. I'd like to begin by inviting you to sit back in a comfortable position or stand in a fixed spot. Shut your eyes if you're comfortable doing so, or cast your gaze downward. Now take a deep breath and notice the feeling of air filling your lungs. Hold your breath for a few seconds. Release your breath slowly and let any tension you may be holding leave your body. Take in another deep breath and hold it. Again, slowly release the air. Even slower now. Take another breath, fill your lungs, and hold the air. Slowly release the breath and shift your focus to the lower half of your body. Try to notice where your feet meet the ground or your thighs and back meet your seat. Now imagine the lower half of your body extending itself into the ground as if you were becoming rooted to that spot. Imagine your lower half becoming plant roots or a tree trunk. And remember to continue taking deep breaths. See if you can extend your roots further into the ground, anchoring and centering you there. Now imagine that standing behind you is a line of your ancestors helping you to become rooted to that spot. Try to notice the strength that your ancestors are passing on to you, their wildest dream. And continue taking deep breaths. As you allow yourself to be enveloped by the love and strength of your ancestors, repeat the following to yourself. I am alive. I am present. I am safe. If you thought or whispered these words to yourself, I would like to invite you to say them out loud if you're comfortable. I am alive. I am present. I am safe. One last time, louder now and filled with your ancestors' strength. I am alive. I am present. I am safe. Take a few more deep breaths, allowing yourself to become more relaxed. Begin slowly uprooting yourself from your spot and wake your body up by slowly moving your muscles. Adjust your arms and legs. Stretch your muscles and open your eyes when you're ready. You did a great job. I hope this exercise allowed for some calming of your system. Remember to continue taking good care of yourself throughout the day, including nourishing and hydrating your body. May you be at peace. Thank you.
Okay, we are back. My video here. So we are back here. We're ready for some of the Q&A. You can always write questions down in the chat, or again, you can use the raise hand function if you would like to. If you like to ask the question yourself. And let's see here.
There is a question in the chat.
There's a question. Okay. Let's see. Which one? Where?
Michael Land. Just scroll up a little.
Okay. Okay. I'm curious to hear more on responding to microaggressions. Could you give some examples regarding when you might not respond, acknowledge the situation versus when you would address it?
That comes with practice. But for example, depending on how pointed it is, now that's not only in your perception, but also you can kind of discern their intent. So for example, the Colorado legislature who refers to a black legislator as buckwheat, tar baby, or even the N-word. So for me, having done the history, I know that the N-word was mimetically descended from a proud place name, like Negar, which means from Africa. Like you call yourself Schwarzenegger, which means black and from Africa. Schwarzkopf, black head. The recent issue with Megan and Archie, and leaking out with the Oprah interview that the royal family was expressing some racism towards them. Well, the head of that family, Charlotte Mecklenburg-Strelitz, was a mulatto queen of England. Mulatto means first generation black-white mix, spoke 3 to 4 languages. Mozart composed music to her. She buried a Bach. There are flowers named after her. There's lots of mixed race people, for example. So if you ground yourself in the history, and you might think that the person is open to understanding that history, you might impart some of it, but otherwise it becomes a strength for you. So for example, I'm a maroon, black Indian. The last white person in my genetic line was the slave owner. So, okay. I have a long, proud history that is in operation today. So I actually, especially when dealing with the skinhead who acknowledge that they're afraid of me, even though when I'm engaging in therapy, I can basically act from a position of power and knowledge and say, I can respond to you in a healing way without calling you out as a racist, though I might. But I know that with some people, being called racist is like being called an alcoholic. And so they're going to be defensive. So part of the response to a microaggression, micro-resistance, is you're going to affirm your common humanity. And you find a bridge to do that. But if not, then you insist on your own humanity, that you have to affirm that. And that's part of, I would say that every Black person, at least, and every person of color went through a period of hating who they were. For me, it happened in 4th grade, where I was the only Black kid in my 4th grade class. And I would get picked last for games for 6 months after, quote unquote, the fat kid. The fat kid was Jewish, so there's probably even a little anti-Semitism in there, mixed in there too. So And for about 3 weeks, I wanted to be white. And then I realized, and I never really told my parents that, but the feeling was there, especially after they laughed at me when I said, that picture of Beethoven is not right. Beethoven is black. And the whole class laughed. Mark, Beethoven isn't black, he's German. I saw a picture in my grandfather's book. He's a mulatto. The history books say he's mulatto, but not your history books. So, that also contributed to my feeling of why the in crowd is white. Why can't I be like the in crowd? I'm going to bring up a controversial thing.
Right.
O.J. Simpson made a statement on Geraldo that God made a mistake in making him black. So when you talk about racial self-hatred, what would, if God made a mistake in making you black and you didn't get that idea from your black mom in the public housing in Hunters Point, San Francisco, you didn't get that from your black wife, your first black wife, who you were also domestically violent with. Where would you get that idea? Not from black people, but you would accept that racial self-hatred, and that would be untreated. And part of the reason that I recognize that racial self-hatred is that other people that kind of internalize that idea.
Absolutely.
And so part of what you have to do is begin to build a real sense of accomplishment to deal with a daily assault. And sometimes you may, like in 4th grade, I may have said Beethoven is black and got laughed at, but now I get paid for saying it on the same thing. So basically on the same evidence, because a lot of Black history, as a movement, because it's a movement towards mental health, is history to a people is like memory to a person. So you have to have a context that strengthens yourself beyond slavery or genocide or whatever wounding happened to your folks.
Hey, Mark, there's another question too, or there's actually several questions in the chat here. One is from David Nestor. Is there a larger movement to identify racism as a public health crisis?
I find it ironic because when I first proposed that in my public health training that they kicked me out of, that racism was a public health problem. And I said, the way you treat it is using memes. And they said, we don't understand the concept of memes. It's 2007 and the concept was invented in 1978. Are you hick? Or are you just OSU? What?
Hey, whoa.
But part of the problem is if you don't you identify a thing as a public health problem that occurs in a large population. Does racism affect large populations? How do you treat it? Do you have a concept of how to treat it? So for example, I like to use memes as an idea and basically use ethnic studies, comparative ethnic studies as the, shall we say, vaccine. Because just like if you break it down, because I was actually prepared to do that, but the simple thing is, I think it's an idea that has been proposed before I started talking about it in the 80s. And I think its time has come. And what usually happens with a new idea is they think you're crazy and they try and discount you. And then its time has come. And I'm glad its time has come, but I'm hoping that we'll actually get to a place where effectively we eliminate it.
There is a question in the chat. It says, can you speak to the medical community's anger, resentment, confusion towards the BIPOC who are or were vaccine hesitant? Additionally, the amount of folks who use the Tuskegee experiment as a scapegoat to almost alleviate themselves from blame when BIPOC folks are hesitant, if that makes sense.
Yeah, sure. Part of what has happened, the Tuskegee syphilis experiment would have been a great culturally competent model to deliver healthcare to underserved populations if they had delivered treatment, but they did not. And because they did not, and because they also used Black doctors, Black nurses as informants, used authorities that were trusted within the community to say, okay, you participated in this experiment and eventually you'll get treatment. But no treatment was delivered. And so that became kind of the model for what happens, what has happened with this pandemic as well. Pandemics continue to happen. If you understand public health, pandemics have been happening since biblical times, and you study where they come from and also the treatment. So the way to deal with things that you're afraid of is with skill. You attack your anxieties with skill. You increase your skill, knowledge, and truth. Part of my family experiencing segregated medicine, the response was to increase our medical literacy on our own, not in school, on our own. And understand how things worked in terms of not only disease, but also what health meant. And that's part of the understanding where some people may or may not know what Tuskegee is, but part of what vaccine hesitancy is the distrust of the mainstream medical community, not necessarily increasing their skill with people of color.
Yeah,
the distrust is real.
Oops, I'm sorry.
And the reason for the distrust is real. Those two vignettes that I talked about, that was more or less current. That's still going on.
The next question is about a therapist. As a therapist, it has been difficult navigating the waters of white clients who make racist comments, whether overtly or covertly, and not wanting to impart my beliefs or perspective on someone who is coming to me for help and who are severely mentally ill. Do you have any insight or advice for professionals on addressing this?
Yes. You stick to what works in therapy, but the racial overlay is, I mean, I run into that problem all the time where when I was seeing mostly white clients, one, they didn't believe I was qualified when I was overqualified. And what won them over was my skill in whatever their presenting problem was in terms of, for example, if it was addiction or alcoholism, okay, here's what recovery is. And if they revealed a history of not necessarily being born racist, but being taught racism by their parents who were abusive, that you're not really hating me, and you can actually make an exception for me, because some racists will do that. They can make an exception for one person of color as an example or an exemplar while professing hatred for others. So you have to kind of take that in stride, build yourself up, and do self-care after you're dealing with them. But remember to stick to your humanity and your essential goodness and affirm healing for them. And they may not take it. We do have non-compliant patients.
There was a question about Blacks not being able to live within the city limits. And was that Eugene?
Yes, that was Eugene.
And then someone else had their hand up and I missed it, that they may have wanted to speak up. If you hit that raise hand function again, I will call on you.
Part of the history of this state, and it's reflected in many institutions. And even though I called out one, that's not to say that others are exempt, because the history of this town, the history of this state, the Ku Klux Klan was run out of the University of Oregon. There was a Ku Klux Klan at OSU that had a students chapter. That is the historical fact. Okay, and so racist ideas and racist ideology will persist into the 20th century, even though 21st century, even though, you know, they aren't having cross burnings on campus. They once did. So that history is infused in present practice to this day. That's kind of what we're talking about. Denial is not a therapeutic skill. It is. So to operate in this environment is to basically deal with not only that history that's present, but common practice.
There was a question. I am wondering if you happen to know the name of the doctor who was the only one who was treating Black families at the old Eugene Clinic.
Oh yeah, I'll have to find that. It's written down somewhere. I don't know who it. There are several people that are like 80 or 90 now that were delivered by him. But yes, they all identify the one doctor that did that. He's passed on too.
And then there is a thank you from Cynthia. Just want to thank you, Dr. Harris, for bringing this training to us here at Cynthium. I have always felt that I am an unprejudiced person, but have grown to know that there is always too much room for improvement.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Out of curiosity, because I'm not from here. I'm not from the Eugene area or from Oregon. I have always thought of this place as super liberal and very welcoming and warm, and very anti-racist. So when we moved here and to kind of learn some of the background and history of the state, it was very surprising to me. I actually wondering how many folks knew that it was a whites only state. That's interesting. So that's good to know. Yeah, I think it plays a huge part in what we see today, and I think some of those things that are lingering on from the past, we can see why we make the national news here in Oregon for some of these things. But oh, go ahead, Mark.
Oh yeah, a lot of it isn't past. So part of, you know, the health disparities where, and I'll tell a good story. And what gives me trust is I was visiting a blood doctor, hematologist, because I had spent time in the hospital and I had a low white blood cell count. And he asked me, this is truly baffling, but do you know whether or not you have North African ancestry? So there have only been really 2 or 3 medical professionals in my 30-year residency in this state that had actually made culturally competent references to race. One was correctly diagnosing my glaucoma and saying, yeah, as an African American, you're at risk. Good. That's the science. You should impart the science to people who are ready to receive the science. And about, you know, did I have North African ancestry? Why, yes, I am. The first person off the boat was from Morocco. So I've talked about because I'm from a medical family, both my father and my older sister said, yeah, the low white blood cell count is normal for us. So great. So that's fearlessly talking about race when race is implicated in terms of not only alleviating health disparities, but specific conditions. Now, the sickle cell trait is from a line of cousins, not in my direct family of origin, but other medical conditions that come from health disparities or genetics should be imparted as part of the health process. And don't be afraid of talking about them. But misdiagnosing, no, that's not cool. Denying medical care that's standard, that's not cool.
Hey, Mark, I wanted to take the time before we start losing a bunch of the folks here. And there's great conversation going on in the chat there, or just information of people talking about their experiences or what they've learned. And I think someone said that they saw in their deed where they couldn't sell their house to someone of color. So that was interesting. But I was wondering if you had recommendations of books, or if people would be interested in books that covered some of the racial disparities and things like that. I know you hit me to medical apartheid that I'm still reading, but that was a really good one for me. Did you have any recommendations to share?
Medical apartheid is good because it talks about some of the history and also common practices like the Mississippi appendectomy, which is women getting hysterectomies without their knowledge. That happened in ICE camps 2 years ago, right? So we're not talking about history. We're talking about this stuff is happening now. I would recommend, because I'm currently using this book, Microaggressions in Everyday Life, where it's basically coming from a therapeutic counseling point of view of identifying microaggressions, not just race, but sexual orientation, trans, across the spectrum. So expanding on Chet Pierce's original work on race and basically an intersectional treatment of different forms of discrimination, because they often follow the same pattern. So that's why it's good to watch out for them.
And there is another question. Unsure how to counsel a Black patient about diabetes control when the first most important tool is to go for a walk. He laughed. It was an eye opener for me.
I'm on, or was on, a continuous glucose monitor, high stress occupation.
Awesome. I'm glad you enjoyed it. I'm glad people are participating as well. We have 5 minutes more. If anyone else had anything they would like to ask or make a comment about, go ahead. Feel free. Oh, okay. Thank you guys very much for being a part of this. We look forward to seeing you next month. Same bat time, same bat place, in 1 month. So you guys have a wonderful day. And
Stay strong.
yes, absolutely. Appreciate you.
Stay safe, stay strong.